Now, this video is going to be a little different, because it's going to be a bit more of a personal story, though I think it's certainly one a lot of fellow Star Wars fans will be able to relate to. And it, of course, as the name of the video implies, is about how the Clone Wars saved Star Wars for me, and likely for a lot of other fans out there as well. And no, I really don't mean that quite as drastically or dramatically as it may sound, at least not for me personally, though I do think for a lot of fans the Clone Wars played a big part in reinvigorating their overall interest and enjoyment in Star Wars after the prequels may have, well, lessened it or even killed it. Because even though I enjoyed the prequels, and I love Revenge of the Sith in particular, I can still understand why many fans didn't enjoy them and why their immediate interest, though not necessarily their overall love for Star Wars, would have faded away in the wake of the prequels. In fact, that's kind of what happened to me, though again not because I didn't enjoy them, but rather because once they were over, I went into a sort of Star Wars lull, or even withdrawal I guess you could say, mainly due to the fact that George Lucas repeatedly insisted there were no more stories left to tell, that there would never be an Episode 7, and how true or not his statements may have been, and how much they may have been impacted by some of the negative reactions to the prequels, is really hard to know. Nevertheless, it seemed like he really meant what he said, and that Star Wars movies were done, though he kept talking about making a live-action Star Wars television series, and said he would as soon as the technology was available to do it so that it looked good enough to be considered Star Wars, without costing what it would have costed at the time to make it look good enough to be considered Star Wars, which he didn't think was going to be in the foreseeable future. And that was a stance I was pretty much okay with because, to put it bluntly, the last thing I wanted was a crappy-looking Star Wars television show. Anyway, I know some of you might want to point out that there was only a 3-year gap between the release of Revenge of the Sith and the release of the Clone Wars movie, which would of course kickstart the whole series, and 3 years was the same amount of time that there was between the release of the prequel movies. So how could I begin to lose interest in Star Wars in that short amount of time, especially with the expanded universe to keep me occupied? Well, first in regards to the expanded universe, I've actually always kind of kept it separate in my mind from the movies and George's Star Wars universe, if you will. And that's not meant as any kind of disrespect towards it, because I do love the EU, but I remember thinking to myself when I first read Heir to the Empire some 25 years ago now, which was my introduction to the EU, that someday George Lucas was going to make a Star Wars 4, and that he wouldn't follow the story, albeit a great one, that Timothy Zahn had told. And you might be wondering why I thought of it as Star Wars 4 and not Episode 7, and that's because I read that book before the prequels ever came out, or before they were ever even announced, and back then, I never thought of the movies as their episode numbers. I just thought of them as Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi. So in my mind, the next movie would be Star Wars 4, until I learned the title and called it as such. Anyway, the EU has always been something separate to me, and in some respects, it was far better than quote-unquote real Star Wars, and in others it was far worse. And to me it was hit and miss, though there were certainly more hits than misses, as well as some really fantastic stories that should be a part of the new canon, and I hope one day will in some respect, and I'm really looking at you, Plagueis novel, Bane trilogy, Knights of the Old Republic, and so on. What I mainly didn't like about it, though, is that at times it seemed to diverge from some of the basic ideas George had established about Star Wars, which I got around because, again, I thought of this as an alternate version of Star Wars. And for that reason, I always wanted George's version of Star Wars to live on somewhere somehow, and when the Clone Wars got announced, I was cautiously excited and optimistic. I had enjoyed the previous 2 Clone Wars series, those that had come out during the prequels, and thought Star Wars lent itself well to animation, at least in that respect, as a series of fun and rather intense action-packed shorts. And then when you factor in George Lucas himself was overseeing the show, it meant his vision would continue. However, there was still this skeptical part of me that wasn't sure Star Wars could be captured the same way in an animated series that it had been on the big screen. I just thought something would feel off about it, and after I saw the Clone Wars movie, I seemed to have those fears confirmed. Because though you could say I enjoyed the Clone Wars movie for the most part, and visually I thought this could pass as Star Wars, there was just something off about it. Perhaps it was just because the story they chose for the movie, which was really just 4 episodes of the show crammed together to be put on the big screen, was not the best choice. Nevertheless, when the series hit Cartoon Network, I was there for every new episode, and in those first 2 seasons there were some real diamonds in the rough, though there was mostly rough. Either way, I still enjoyed the show for the most part, and was just happy to have George Lucas' Star Wars, and to have that gap between episodes 2 and 3 filled with, well, the actual Clone Wars which we only got to see start and end in the movies. So anyway, I kept watching the show, week after week, season after season, when suddenly, and I don't know if there was an actual eureka moment where it all just came to me or not, but I realized, wow, this show is really, really good now. This is Star Wars. Somehow I had gone from having to remind myself to watch the new episodes every week, to looking forward to the next one. I realized that not only could Star Wars animated shows be done really well, but that they had some huge advantages over the movies, like having the time to really slow down and explore all the characters, and to go into stories that the movies obviously never had time for. And as I look back now, it's somewhere during Season 3 that, in my opinion, this show went from a pretty good one that I'd recommend to hardcore fans, to an amazing one that I'd recommend to any and all Star Wars fans. And the truly crazy part about the Clone Wars is that not only did it recharge my excitement for Star Wars, but it took it to whole new levels, and that's no easy feat considering I'm a lifelong fan. Because as much as I love new Star Wars movies, they're like rare events that only come around every few years at best, or at least they did back then. This, however, was new Star Wars each and every week, and it was being done extremely well. And one thing I hear quite often from fellow fans is that the Clone Wars makes the prequels so much better, and I hear that from both prequel haters and defenders alike. And yes, I do realize the prequels should have to stand on their own as movies, and whether or not they do that is a matter of personal opinion. Either way, I think it's safe to say that the Clone Wars recaptured a lot of fans that had all but given up on Star Wars. It saved Star Wars for them after the prequels had soured them on it. Or, as is the case with me, it helped take some people's love for Star Wars to new levels that they may not have thought it could even go to. And I truly feel that what the Clone Wars did for Star Wars is immeasurable, or perhaps it can start to be measured by the response its return for a 7th and final season has gotten, and by the negative reaction to Resistance. And why Star Wars fans seem to be getting so upset about this new show isn't because it's just being aimed strictly at very young children. It's because they know what can be done with an animated show, and they see this as wasted potential or a wasted opportunity. As I said, in some respects, many actually, the Clone Wars was better than even a Star Wars movie, and with Resistance, that certainly doesn't appear to be the case. And yes, I know some will point out that fans should just be happy to have a final season of the Clone Wars coming, to get the ending we've been asking for since it got abruptly cancelled, which wasn't a great first impression on Disney's part, by the way. And I know we're going to get a live-action Star Wars series, which, if the rumors are true, will have a big enough budget so that it truly looks like Star Wars should, and I think it's clearly meant to be our Clone Wars replacement, if you will, or a show aimed at older Star Wars fans to help really fill that void in between the movies for those who don't partake in the books, comics, and so on. And though I am 100% okay with a show just aimed at kids, it's kind of sad to see Star Wars animation for a wider age range presumably coming to an end after the 7th season of Clone Wars. And as I've said before, though Rebels wasn't quite as good as the Clone Wars, it was still more than good enough in my opinion, and appealed to the proverbial kid of all ages. And I actually thought that was one of the strengths of the show, that it could be enjoyed by the whole family or just a random Star Wars fan of any age who wanted to watch it. And I'm unsure why, at least from the vibe the first Resistance trailer is giving off, that this is something they seem to be moving away from. Then again, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe Resistance will turn out to be a great show. There's always hope, right? Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me your Clone Wars story. What did this show mean to you? Did it reinvigorate your love for Star Wars after the prequels, or maybe take it to new levels even? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.